One of the things that I got interested in that just once I got started into sort of this business was just a little bit of the history of the train of Saluda, how things came to be. And so then that is somewhat what this talk is. And as you know, that we have the Saluda grade, which whenever it was in operation, that it was the steepest mainline commercial railroad grade in the country. And that included all the Rockies, all the Sierra Nevadas, and that routine. But you got to get your qualifiers right. It was a commercial railroad and it was standard gauge. And so then, yes, you can go out and find a ski lift or something which is steeper. But in terms of the commercial railroad, it was the steepest. And what we count as being the grade, and this came from Drayton because there's one of their buddies that every town has the hill. And so then he thought that this being the hill, and it what is 2.7 miles that goes from right where Green River Adventures is down to what I refer to as the non-existent town of Melrose. It amuses me that on state maps and that type of thing that they show Melrose as being close to the same size as Saluda, and in Melrose there is nothing there. So at one time it was the train station or stop for doing service work on the trains at the bottom of the grade. But this is the bottom of the grade, and if you go onto USGS maps, you can actually click out points and get a profile of the elevation, and this is what that 3 miles looks like in terms of the steepness of the grade. So that is the Saluda grade, and this is what we're all talking about. Melrose is down here, this little ditch is the Pacolet River, and then up here you've got Green River Adventures at the top, and away it goes. So it was just fun being able to get that map for somebody that kind of likes to be able to visualize things. Now then, there was other things that this hill did, and one of the ones which was one of my creative pieces of history is that I was claiming that the Saluda grade changed how engineers communicated with each other. So that was the okay. Now my wife wanted us to get a show of hands between laughs and groans whenever I said that, but it sounded like the groaners were at least polite. So that was the grade. Now it started, and I count it as it started as a dream in Charleston, South Carolina in the early 1830s. They had a little feller that was the Friendship of Charleston. They recognized that this was a tremendous advantage in the area of transportation, and the dream was if we had this rail connection thing to the Ohio River, think what it would do to our harbor. And so they started that, and in 1835, South Carolina chartered a company called the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Charleston Railroad Company just to explore this. But I thought that that was very foresighted thinking, and they had, in the 1830s, there was a rail connection line to Aiken, South Carolina. That was the longest railroad in the world, not just South Carolina, not just the United States, but just thinking from Charleston to Aiken was the longest railroad in the world. So their foresightful thinking in the 1830s kind of included this as part of their dream. So they chartered the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Charleston, and they had a little bit of difficulty with North Carolina. Just can't imagine anybody from South Carolina thinking that there could be difficulty with North Carolina. But that was the way it went. And that was because, as you can see in the last bullet, that North Carolina was considered the Rip Van Winkle state. We had all kinds of resources, we had natural capabilities, we had good stuff, and the state was doing nothing with it. So they actually got a hold of an old map and said, look at South Carolina. They've got Charleston. Look at Virginia. They've got Norfolk. Look at our harbors. We got nothing. And so then they had the idea that was a little bit like the Field of Dreams, that if we build it, they will come. So it was the idea that for the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Charleston Railroad to go, they needed a connection here to head up north. So this was the dream that was up in this way. North Carolina, sitting out here in Raleigh, said, we got a potential opportunity for a harbor at Beaufort, which became Morehead City, or Wilmington. We need a railroad to get to there. And so then already you saw this contention building of the people in Asheville had spent in this general western North Carolina area, had spent their whole lives in business with the people in South Carolina heading towards Charleston and that type of thing. And as I said, North Carolina being so long in nature, all in here, it might as well have been trying to deal with the man on the moon. We don't know anything about them, just because we've got the same connection to Raleigh, but we want this. So Asheville was having a little bit of trouble with the antithesis between the dreams of North Carolina, and they chartered the Western North Carolina Railroad, and the Charleston concept. So already you started seeing a little political conflict coming up. So we call it that the race was on. Asheville had no rail connection, and they thought that maybe this might not be too bad of an idea. And so then with the Western North Carolina Railroad, again, Asheville didn't care about going to Wilmington. What do that for? But that's where North Carolina was heading, and they started with the Western North Carolina Railroad, and by 1861 they had track laid all the way to Morganton, which still was another side of the world as far as you're concerned in doing business in 1861. Then, as I say, they took 4 years out to fight a civil war, and they got back, and South Carolina decided to get in the game because the head honcho of the North Carolina Railroad stole all the money that was in there. So they were kind of broke. And to answer that, South Carolina chartered the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad. And as I say here, that was in 1873. So that was a railroad that was trying to get a connection between Spartanburg and obviously Asheville, but then to continue on through Tennessee, Kentucky, to get to the Ohio River. They resolved their issues, and this was one of the interesting things, that whenever you were laying railroad tracks, gauge, that there was difficulty between the broad gauge and the standard gauge. And if you've ever seen the movie on the general of the Civil War, that was kind of stemmed on that particular movie. But the broad gauge was you had 5 foot distance between two rails. Standard gauge was you had 4 foot 8.5 inches between the rails. And so they were not interchangeable. And you did not want to have different gauges as you were trying to do something productively, because it meant stopping your train, emptying it out, loading it on another train, and getting on down. Now, it was under the influence of the Pacific Union and the 1860s arena of getting rail traffic from the West Coast to St. Louis that greatly helped standardize the gauge. So in 1886, the edict went out from Washington that everyone is going to spend the weekend of June 1st getting your gauge of your railroads to standard gauge. And they did, but that was one of those early problems that they got to argue about. Do we be broad gauge or do we be standard gauge? So that got resolved, and the rail line to Asheville was still a ways. It was very interesting in the reading, and that South Carolina got the road to the state line, the North Carolina-South Carolina state line, but coming out of Spartanburg, it was like, well, where do we run this railroad? And they said, oh, just kind of head up to the state line and kind of bias a little bit to the west because we want to just go up to Asheville. But they really had no great laid out technical plan. So particularly once they got to North Carolina, it was became again a guessing game. But this was the race that Asheville was on, and the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad was in the race. Now then, I contend that that company had three good things going for it. Two gentlemen. One was the chief architect, which was Thaddeus Coleman. And another one was the chief engineer, who was Captain Charles Pearson. And Charles Pearson was, of course, named after Pearson Falls Road. Or maybe, I think it might have been the other order. But those were, in terms of the jobs that they had been assigned, were brilliant. Thaddeus Coleman had experience with the Western North Carolina Railroad and knew the area, knew the land, had that kind of experience. So I mean, they weren't just fresh on the drawing board. North Carolina also, from Raleigh, agreed to provide convict labor to support the effort. And the fact that it was now Spartanburg to Asheville greatly renewed the enthusiasm of the residents in Asheville. So then they had those things going for them, and they got the things going, and they had financial difficulties, as everyone does. But on 1874, they broke ground in Spartanburg to start this railroad coming to the Northwest. And in 1877, they made it to Tryon. So that was a very good thing. But once they got to Tryon, that they looked out the window and said, shucky darn, we got a cliff to go up. And in essence, that geologically is what they literally had. That Tryon is only, by the crow, about 6 miles down the road. There's a 1,000-foot difference in elevation. And there are no foothills. That anybody that takes I-26 from Columbus to Saluda, you are just coming up the Blue Ridge Escarpment. So that was their challenge. Thad Coleman, he was the architect, like I was saying, and he was very familiar with all the earlier proposed lines. Now, it seems as if the most favorable one back there was pretty much where I-26 ran. Go to Columbus, then go up over the Whiteout Mountain, then continue down, get to Saluda, and then keep on heading. Well, that had something like 11 or 12 different tunnels, trestles, and all grades of stuff to go through, and would have been very, very difficult. Captain Pearson looked at things and said, why don't you follow the Pacolet River up? And the Monday morning quarterbacks was all saying, oh, you're going to get us all killed. Well, they argued that for a while until Captain Pearson looked at things and said, Thaddeus and anyone else willing to listen, the ground is no good over there. And so he had made the assessment that where I-26 was going in was not suitable for a railroad. He convinced Thaddeus, which was very easy to do, the two of them joined together and said, we're going up the Pacolet River. Now, it just amused me greatly that a couple years ago, I got to speak with Ellie Pearson, who was a granddaughter of Captain Charles. We were standing right over there at the diorama. And by the way, Larry, she pointed to that house and said, this was the house I was born in, but you've got it turned the wrong way. And I said, oh, this is going to be a fun conversation. But she got to talking about her grandfather and the fact that he said the ground was no good over there. And then this 90-year-old woman just grinned from ear to ear and said, when they put in I-26, they proved Granddaddy right. Because I-26 was delayed for at least 8 years while they tried to figure out how to get that mountain to simply hold an interstate highway. And so then he knew what he was talking about, and it was coming up the Pacolet River. There was quite a challenge for that, like I said, this 3 miles averages 4.7% grade, and it has places that are reputed to be over 5%. Now, the old steam engines didn't like anything steeper than 2%. So they fully recognized they were in for a significant challenge. But despite all of that the first train came up and arrived in Saluda July 4th, 1878. And so they made it, took another year to get to Hendersonville. And by this time, the race to Asheville had been won because there was a track that went from Asheville to Salisbury in the old Spencer shops in that region. So it went due east out of Asheville, got to Salisbury. So now Asheville at least had a train line. But they took them another 8 years to get to Asheville. Now they did have financial difficulty, and it's a little bit interesting because at first, whenever they had first come out, the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad had financial difficulty. They got reorganized as the Asheville-Spartanburg Railroad. So they just flipped the names and said, okay, that's good for a new company. But then they ran into some difficulty, and the Richmond and Danville line took over management of this line. Now, the Richmond Danville was, those boys ran a tight ship. That let's just say that brotherly love was pretty far down the list of things that they specialized in. And I didn't bring it with me, but I had a writing from a old Rail Trains magazine relaying a conversation between an engineer that lost control on the Saluda grade and his supervisor in Asheville. And it was the kind of thing that the supervisor spent most of the conversation discussing this guy's parentage and his lack thereof, so to speak. And the guy merely said, you reside in an office. You have never been on a train which is on its way to eternity. I quit. And he did. And so that was just kind of a subtle example of the Richmond and Danville operation of things. So mercifully, in around 1894, then the Southern Railroad brought up all this. And that became kind of the first major rail line. Up until then, you just had little pockets of lines that would operate a railroad, but the Southern had the full gamut in mind. Now, one of the difficulties, and back to the original cartoon that I showed you, that you, coming down Saluda grade, you might lose your brakes. That was not a good thing. And so I just kind of made a list, and this was going over, taking Matthew Baumgartner's book, and just kind of doing an outline of it, of the fatalities that had occurred on the grade. So first train up the hill was 1878, and in 1880 they lost 14 just due to a runaway. 1886 there was more, and this was unfortunate because they had the entire work crew on flatbed cars taking them down, lost control, and they slid off. And quite a few were killed there. 1890, we had some more, and you can see I'm kind of keeping count here. And so by the 1890s, we had lost 26 people, and that would have just been in 12 years. And so that also was not that good. Now, Baumgartner's book also points out that sociologically speaking, human life was not as valuable as it is taken to be today. And so then, okay, so we lost 14. And besides, the work crew doesn't really count because they were just convicts, and the convicts were basically then slaves that didn't understand freedom. So that doesn't matter. And there was just kind of this very caustic attitude of, who cares? Then it came out a little, well, a little bit later on, but certainly this last one is still with us today, where a cattle train came down, lost control, flipped over, and the 29 cattle that died supplied Saluda with probably steak dinners for quite some time. But that is still known today as slaughter pen cut. And that is the main challenge, that if you've come down the grade with no brakes, you'll be going across the Pacolet River somewhere between 60 and 75 miles an hour. Slaughter pen cut is less than half a mile away, and it's a pretty sharp turn, and you flip over, and many have died there. They had a 10-year break on runaways and wrecks and that type of thing, and then somehow the summer of 1903 was a very rough summer. In a 6-week period, they had 3 runaways. And the first one was our favorite engineer, Pitt Ballou. And his crew exited the train because Southern now had become more instructive in that whether you stay with the train or you leave the train is up to you, not up to us. And so his crew jumped the train, but Pitt Ballou was still on it. I always said, I took a paraphrase from the aerospace industry. They always say that a good landing is whenever you can walk away from the airplane. A great landing is when you can walk away from it and use the plane again. I think that 100 years earlier, that phrase had been first changed. A good engineer stays with his train. A great engineer knows when to get off. And so then Southern seemed to be more along those lines. So they put out the edict and said that we do not like the loss of our trains, of our personnel, and the dangers of the safety. If please, you employees, tell us how to improve the safety of the Saluda grade, or we are shutting it down. Pitt Ballou was in the equivalent, or the forerunner to Mission Hospital, trying to recover from his injuries that he had gotten in July of 1903, and dreamt up, gravity got us into this situation, I'll bet gravity can get us out. So he explained to the maintenance supervision the concept of a safety runoff track. And the supervision liked that sufficiently so that he explained it. And according to the introduction, if anyone was listening, I spent most of my career in international industry, and it just blows my mind. He gave them the idea in August of 1903, and they were operational in December of 1903. And so that was quite the appreciation of the suggestion. So they put in 2 safety runoff tracks. These were manned by a switchman 24/7. And one is just a mile down the road here. And if you hit your horn 3 times, was the message to the switchman, I have left Saluda and I am under control. So that switchman would go close the switch to the main line. Fail-safe technique, it stayed to the safety runoff track. If there was a mix-up in communication, we're running your train up the runoff track, not down the rest of the hill. So that worked out quite well. And the number of wrecks, and for other reasons also, we won't get into the Interstate Coal Company, had an improvement on the people that were getting killed on the grade. Like I say, in 1940, there was one train that went off safety runoff track number 1, and it went all the way to the end of it. Everyone but the brakeman had gotten off, and the brakeman, unfortunately, was crushed by all the coal that came rushing forward to him. And that was the last recorded death, at least, on the Saluda grade, was in 1940. So the safety runoff tracks were the great saving idea to that. And one story that I always liked is to how you didn't necessarily have to have bad brakes in order to experience the runoff track. That in 1916, this whole area was flooded by what could be the equivalent to 2 hurricanes. One came in from the Atlantic, one came in from the Gulf, and they butted heads over Asheville and flooded Asheville, flooded Hendersonville, and flooded out the Pacolet River. it wiped out the trestle that is down there at Melrose. And all the trains were stopped except one. And they had a runner make it to the switchman and explain the trestle was out. So whenever the passenger train was coming down the hill, he went up the runoff track unbeknownst to the engineer. Engineer jumps out madder than blazes, yelling and screaming, hooting and hollering, and probably even used a few dirty words. But the switchman just said, you know, I just saved your life, all your passengers' lives, and I saved your train. Who'd you say that I was? And they accordingly went. Now, it took them another 2 weeks to get out of there, but they were all alive. So that was just one place where the safety runoff tracks did something. They saved the train, but it was something other than no brakes. Here they are, their safety runoff track number 1, right before the very steep 110-degree turn that's down here. The tunnel that is on Pearson Falls Road, we affectionately refer to as Graffiti Tunnel. It's right here. So you have the safety runoff track was just above that. Then here's the second one in Melrose. And so these are the two safety runoff tracks. And this one was pulled up in the 50s, and for reasons we'll get into. And this one is still there, and you can see it as long as you like kudzu, weeds, trees, bushes, what have you. So I want to talk just a little bit about, now we got the trains to town, we need to talk a little bit about the trains. So some of the earliest ones, actually the earliest fellow that came up the hill in 1878 was called an American. But these then, that Southern particularly was using, there was a consolidation, a Mikado, articulated, the Santa Fe, and then mountain type was a passenger engine. These designations that are on here with these numbers that we get excited about, this means that there was 2 front guide wheels on it, then 8 power wheels, and then this is the number of wheels underneath the cab. So here, with, for instance, this one, you had 2 front wheels. In other words, there's just one axle. There was a wheel on either end of the axle. And you had 4 driving wheels with 2 wheels on each axle. So that became a 280. They worked out fine, and to get a little bit more oomph, and a little bit later they had the Mikado, which was just another name for a train. That was produced by the Baldwin Train Works, and in the early 1900s, the Nippon Railway made quite an order to them, and Baldwin decided that we wanted to be respectful of this very profitable customer, and so they named the train style, type, the Mikado, after the Emperor of Japan. I thought that it was very interesting that those Mikados were still in service during World War II. And the B&O Railroad and the Pacific Union formally changed the name of the Mikado to the MacArthur. And they also were known as Mikes. But that was, I thought, a nice little subtle in your face. The articulated were very interesting because they had 2 different drive sets on them. And whenever we say that they were articulated, that they had 2 sets of 8 wheels, and to be able to get around turns, they had to be separately on swinging trucks so that they could move independently. That was the articulation that came in that word. Now, they're also known as the Malay, or in this country, the Manny. But what Malay did, he was a Swiss engineer, and he had 2 sets of train wheels. And he took the steam out of the rear set and directed it towards the front set. So they had to have larger pistons in the front one because the steam would be at a lower pressure. And that created havoc on going up the mountains just for the dynamic instability of the train having 2 different torque levels between the 2 different sets. So I always said that, you know, it was a nice idea from the Swiss engineer, but it took Yankee ingenuity to get it to work in this country, and that was the Manny. Now, the next one, this is a consolidation, and it pretty much is just your old standard steam engine. Quite old. They started making them in the 1830s, 1850s, but it served them well here. And this is an articulated, and you'll notice that we have this is serving as a pusher. To come up the grade, you needed a helper engine. So then that was what Melrose was for, was to put on a pusher behind the train. And these articulated engines made a very good pusher. So you would see that. Then here's one that is in the main function, but you can see that here is one set of drivers, and then here is the second set of drivers. So that's how this became a 2, 8, 8, 2 to be there. And they were used quite a bit under that articulated. Then you had the Santa Fe, which was another, it wasn't an articulated engine, but it was a very long, smoky brute, and it was made for the mountain regions to be used in areas like this, Kentucky, and that routine. The difficulty was that it produced so much steam that as it was being used on what's called the rat hole, which is the line from, Louisville or Cincinnati down to Chattanooga, there's nothing but tunnels there. And it would get into the tunnel and asphyxiate the crew. So Southern was not pleased with using Santa Fe's in the Tennessee, Kentucky region. But then they looked at the map and, well, their old Captain Pearson, he developed a line that had no tunnels. So they said this would be great. So they sent the Santa Fe's down here, and we had to change them just a little bit because they used to have rigid front wheels. The two wheels in the front were rigid. They had to float them so they could just make it around the turns here on the Saluda grade. But the Santa Fe's were very, very popular and used for a long, long time on the grade here. So there's one pulling the train, and there's another one pushing it. So that would be the way that they get up there. And this is interesting because this is safety runoff track number 1. Just coming through the woods there. This is the mountain. It's just merely a faster and pulls passenger trains instead of freight. And so then that is it. But now with all of these good steam engines, you know, you can always have too much of a good thing. So they decided they have to change the prime mover completely and get into the era of the diesel. And that started in 1949, and by 1955 that the transition had been made to diesel engines coming up the hill. There was 2 advantages to them in terms of operating on the Saluda grade. One is that they had dynamic braking, and I guess that the best equivalent that we can, think of is that if you are driving your car, you need to slow down a little bit. You can downshift and let the engine do some braking instead of your brake pads do the braking. Well, a diesel engine, the only thing a diesel motor does on a diesel engine is run a generator. The prime mover on the diesel train is actually electric motors. So they could run the, under power, if you wanted to slow it down, you could run that electric motor backwards, produce heat, and that'd be taking energy out of the system, so the train would slow down. And that was called dynamic braking. On diesel engines, you'll notice there's some big fans up on top of the cab, up on top of the engine. Those are heat exchangers, just to do something with the heat that is generated by running those electric motors backwards. So that dynamic braking was a great contribution, that you don't pop the clutch on a steam engine and get more steam, whereas you can do it on a diesel engine, and get more electricity. So dynamic braking was very good. and also since they were being driven by electric motors, that the torque, namely the force that went to the wheel, between the wheel and the steel rail, was much smoother. Because think how like your engine in your car goes. You got a piston that's thumping and bumping. So you had very unequal torque being transmitted by the steam engine, whereas on a diesel you had smooth torque transfer. And that made then the idea of being able to slip and slide much more remote than it was with the steam engines. So those were two major advantages they got with the diesel. And they still were very, very careful on the grade because it was complicated to get the trains down the track. And as I say, that it went interesting that Southern, and you can see this certainly whenever you look at some of the videos about the checks that have to be made for the brakes and the things that the crew has to do, which they were doing right here in Saluda in terms of checking everything, was quite complicated. So with the diesels, that list of things that they had to do was like 21 steps. With the old steam engine, it was only 10 steps. But that saved them greatly. That there was only two that I'm aware of, Larry correct me, but recorded like wrecks with the diesel engines. One in the early 1960, and the other one was a lot of pictures of it, like there's a picture of it on that poster in 1971.
And we're just a few days from it being 50 years ago, or just slightly over.
There you go. That, according to my precise calculations, that it says November 14th. So it was earlier this week, 50 years ago, that that one went. But that was made for some very dramatic pictures. But the train, no one was hurt whenever that went over. All three engines flipped over. It hit the safety runoff track, rolled, and inside of 2 days, the main line was operational again. And so then they were cleaning it up for the next 6 or 8 months, but it didn't shut the track down. But that was the era of the diesel, and it was interesting in that going down the hill with the diesels, that you had to check everything very cautiously. And one of the items was that the road foreman who was stationed here, he served as a harbor pilot to take the train down the grade. You just didn't let any rank and file engineer go do that. It took an experienced individual to know the feeling of the grade and take it down. So the road foreman, or I like to call him the harbor pilot, got on here and took it down to Melrose and then got off again. He had a special key, and we always talk about the Saluda key. But in terms of the dynamic braking, what this key did was that there was a type of characteristic of trains, which is that way to this day, with the Westinghouse brake on it. The Westinghouse brake is a kind of brake we simplistically in our mind can think that whenever I push the pedal that increases the pressure pushes the pads against the rotor and everything stops. The Westinghouse brakes works opposite of that, that it takes, you reduce pressure because the pads stay off the rotor because of higher pressure. You reduce that and then they squeeze. The reason for that, and the great thing that it did, was then if the train comes uncoupled and they lose the pressure from the engine or this individually, the train is left with the brakes locked, not wide open. So that was Westinghouse's great contribution to the rail industry, was the Westinghouse brakes. But then what this automatic braking system was, that if you're in a train, you're using the dynamic brakes that I tried to explain a little bit earlier, and you lose your brakes, everything is going to be locked up. Well, you don't want to also have your cab locked up. So this key, what the standard brake control system did was if you lost brake pressure behind you, it shut off the dynamic braking. And coming down Saluda, if you even lost all the brakes so that everything was bound up tight, by that time you are sliding on the rail. The brakes aren't even in the picture anymore, and you need every advantage you can get, namely your dynamic brake. So just because your brakes are locked up, don't shut off your dynamic braking. That's the only thing you got, because you're going to be sliding. So that special Saluda key removed that aspect of the brake control system, and was beneficial in that. But the other items that you can see, that the brakes had to be cooled once we got down to the bottom, and that's what the run from down around Vaughn's in Tryon area, and also close to the Fort Creek Bridge, that's where they just have to stop and let the brakes cool, and then they could start up and go again. And that was then going west up the hill. You had trains that had to be tripled, and that mainly means that they took a long freight train, cut it into thirds, left 2/3 of it down there, brought 1/3 up here, left it over here. If you've ever looked across that bridge, well, the bridge right out there going to Green River Restaurant, that you can see where the old depot used to be, and there's a set of triple tracks out there. Well, for this little train depot, why do you need triple tracks? Well, that's where they stored the sections of freight trains that they had split up to bring them up a third at a time. So they had good use for it. But that's the reason why there's triple tracks out there where the depot used to be. And obviously, if it had a helper behind it, it needed those. So the diesels, here's the one that we were talking about here, our F7. This was the first one that, in fact, it's a picture of the first train that came, a diesel train that came up the hill in 1949. And then they had quite a few trains that were made by General Motors. This is the EMD type, and there's several diesel engines from that. The SD45s and SD40-2. The train watchers get super excited over this, but it kind of it's not going to be on the test, so you don't have to pay careful attention.
Point out to the visitors
Thank you.
the depot.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
You're in today.
This is the depot with quite a long, that's 110 car coal train just coming by it, being hauled by a reasonably modern EMD train. But it's also interesting that right here is the caboose, which is over behind Green River Adventure as a bed and breakfast. So if you want to see this caboose, just go on over and look in the back of the parking lot, and there it is, hopefully someday making tons and tons of money for somebody. But yeah, that's where the depot used to be. Thanks, Mark. This is just another, GP59 was another EMD, and these were all made by General Motors. And then in 1994, Southern went with General Electric to get their locomotive trains. SD60 was a modern one. And then this is a C39. So we just made the switch over to General Electric. But I like this one because as you're driving down the road here, right across from the post office, you can see this sign, which is stopboard number 1. And you can see stopboard number 2 also because it's right there in the window, absconded with. Drayton says that he can get permission to steal that sign because if he doesn't, somebody else is. And he said that's too valuable of a sign to lose. These stopboards, that's another whole story that we could get into, but on draping, how you drape a train over a peak of a mountain and keep it balanced. So they were indications there. And then here's another General Electric diesel down at Melrose. This is safety runoff track number 2. And so the mates for the end of the era and just the economic decisions that had to be made. Passenger service was very lucrative this area, but in 1968, they had come to the conclusion that cars, the interstate highway system, had removed the business from the passenger train. So December 5th, 1968 was the last commercial, or Carolina special coming through here. And then passenger service on Southern Railroad was done. Then there was two companies which were the prime reason why Southern Railroad kept going down the Saluda grade, was the Belmont coal-fired power plant out of Charlotte and the paper company that's in Canton, Champion Paper in Canton. And both of those, Belmont started heading for natural gas. That coal was losing, and not enough wood chips to go up to Champion. So they were simply for an economic reason that on December 1st, 2001, the last freight train came through here. So, and that 20th anniversary, be coming up in a week or two, was the last train on the grade. And so that ended it, and the way that Southern shuts things down is they decided, and I think over on the, somewhere over there we've got the copy of the memo that talked about them shutting down the service, and it went from mile marker 26 to mile marker 45. So they pulled 19 miles out of service. And whenever they pull something out of service, this is up in Zirconia at mile marker 26, they split the rail, cut it like this, move it over, and then take a dump truck full of dirt and pile on it. So you're not going to make a mistake of, oh my goodness, I didn't know it was closed. That it's closed for sure. And that's up at Zirconia, just right in the back of the Zirconia Baptist Church that is up there. Then you go down to Landrum, and this is mile marker number 45, and this is right across from the Lynn engine repair shop on 176, just a little bit south of the light that there at Route 14. And you come out here, and they did the same thing by separating the rails and dumping their pile of dirt on top of it. So that's how Norfolk Southern now takes 19 miles out of service. But they still have the tracks down, and they will adamantly, they still own it. This is what happens whenever you don't maintain a railroad for 20 years. So that's a significant washout, and all the kudzu and the trees. So they got washout, they got trees covering it. This, by the way, is one of the primary reasons why trespassing on the tracks is a Class 3 misdemeanor. That if this is covered with green, fresh kudzu, and you're walking along tie to tie, you can't even see this, except as it goes by as you're falling down the mountain. So I always warn people, if you do not heed our warning not to walk the track, but you get out there and twist your ankle, don't try suing Southern Railroad, that they will come back with a vengeance. But that's where it stands now. And this is how Mother Nature gets into the game, that it's very difficult with all the kudzu that is there. So Charleston provided us the dream, and the dream was operational for 125 years. And it was very good, and it was very good for this general area. This first bullet is interesting because there were people here since 1780 in this general area. Most all of them were paces, but most, not all of them. But the railroad kept referring to going up Saluda Mountain. And I've always found it fascinating, there is no Saluda Mountain. You can check all the maps and you won't find one. But it was always referred to that. So in 1881, Pace's Gap chartered with North Carolina as Saluda, North Carolina. So the railroad did not put the town on the map. The railroad put Saluda on the map. Subtle difference, but still. And the tourism, I think, was almost, I mean, they had to sense that it was going to be good, but I don't think they sensed, the railroads early, how good it was going to be. But as I also tell the patrons here, when the people in Charleston realized you could both breathe and sleep in the summertime at the same time, they were up here in droves. And Saluda was the first town on the edge of the Blue Ridge Escarpment. So if you're coming to the mountains, Saluda is the first town you come to. And so then we can see in that next to the last bullet that in 1893 there was 41,000 passengers. 6 years or 7 years later, that was 1/3 of a million passengers that were coming up. And this was an extremely busy and profitable depot for the Southern Railroad. They were getting into the hotel building business, and it was just, I think, if you had asked them in the early 1870s, they'd tell you that coal would be the primary mover, but instead it was people. So that worked out well for them. So in that, since that was the 1903, they decided that Saluda needed a depot. So there it is, and it's looking east, and this bridge is now the 176 bridge right out there. You can see this building very clearly, that's the town hall, but that's where the depot was, busily doing its thing. And today, it looks like that. And it's kind of wasted effort, but this is what the interior looks like, believe it or not. And that concludes our conversation and discussion.
Let's give Dave a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you, and good evening.